Hello and welcome back to the podcast. It's great to have another episode. This podcast is produced by the Canadian Lutheran Gospel Network, a ministry of the Canadian Association of Lutheran Congregations. And Connor, thank you for nodding. I finally got that right. Anyone that's
Perfect.
heard me a few times knows that I've butchered that. So it's finally right. If you have any questions or would like to find out more about either the CLGN or CELC, the Canadian Association of Lutheran Congregations, you can find a link in the description below, or you can just search it up on Google and I'm sure you will find it. I believe it's www.calc.ca, I think,
Yes,
is the webpage for that.
that's
So
it.
I encourage you to go and look. We'd love to hear from you. So today's topic, I'm joined here with Connor Longafee, and I'm Pastor Roland Weisbrot from Medicine Hat, Alberta. I serve as the Associate Pastor of Victory Lutheran Church. But today's topic, we're going to be talking about the two kingdoms doctrine of Luther and how it impacts what we understand the church's role to be, and conversely, what we don't understand the church's role to be. So hot topics here today.
Absolutely. I think we could start with something that we all know, which which is, and it should not be a surprise to anybody, but perhaps to some listeners, they will be surprised to find out that they are mistaken about some things. And here's what the problem is that there's lots of people in the Church of Christ, not the denomination Church of Christ, goodness me, but but in all of the churches that belong to Christ, there are lots of people who have mistaken the church to be a socio-political or economic entity or institution. And this can look like a lot of different things. This can look like what's called the social gospel, where you will not so much hear a preaching of your forgiveness of sins or even the concept of sin, except for a kind of socio-economic political sin. And then the healing of Christ is not so much something that he actually did, but something that you're going to do for your neighbor, such as tax benefits. And it sounds ridiculous, but I'm sure if someone preached it really well to you, you'd feel pretty bad for the less fortunate, and you might even be convinced. And it is a problem. That's a problem. We also have on the other side people who have turned the church into the super conservative talking point club and the Israel club and the whatever, the America club, and a lot of the ones in perhaps who have come out of similar instances as our own church, where they have left the main line over certain ethical issues, have mistaken the church for an ethics club, right? So it can look like a lot of different things. Do you want to say anything about the way that you perceive it taking any kind of form in concrete reality before you, Pastor Roland?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in addition to what you're saying, really what we're seeing, unfortunately, in our time is just the politicization of the church. And that's either as on the right wing of things or the left wing of things. And at the end of the day, people are mistaking the church for what it is. They're trying to turn it into a lobby group. They're trying to turn it into a voting bloc. They're trying to turn it into a place to experiment with social theory. They're trying to turn it into a community club. They're trying to turn it into a social action committee. All these things of which, quite frankly, aren't the role of the church. I mean, sure, of course, by existing in this world and by preaching the gospel, the church does touch on basically the entirety of human existence and impacts it. But the role of the church is not to be confused by the fact that it happens to impact those other elements. And I think that's really what we want to dive into today with Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms, which I personally believe provides the proper sort of corrective to a lot of people's ecclesiologies today, which sort of says, no, that isn't the job of the church. It corrects the viewpoints of the Roman Catholics, but it also corrects the viewpoint of the radical Anabaptist view of the church as well, where, at the end of the day, for the Anabaptists, they basically think the church is this holy place and the world is evil and, that's just awful and we just got to be holy and pure. Well, that's not the case. God created the governing systems of this world as well and ordained them to have power and authority as well. And this is something we see very clearly in Romans I mean, at the end of the day,
Yeah.
there's nothing that isn't under the power and authority of God. I mean, Jesus says right before he ascends into heaven at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And that doesn't mean, well, oh, sorry, you just don't have power over this Jesus. Yeah, no, that's not how it works. And so, it's a corrective there. And then, of course, on the other hand, you get the Roman Catholic Church that tries to marry the church and the state. And the doctrine of two kingdoms says, no, they're not the same thing. The church's job isn't to run the state, nor is it to prop up the state for that matter. The church is not an agent of the state, but conversely, the state is not necessarily an agent of the church either. They interact, but they have distinct roles ordained by God. And I think that's what the doctrine of the two kingdoms understands. And I honestly think today it could offer a great corrective for people that just politicize church bodies and politicize the church.
Yeah, I think, and before we get into it, I think we should, at some point within this hour, mention what the church is and what the church is, and the state, sorry, is to make a few things clear. First of all, Lutherans are not so much saying that there needs to be a separation between church and state, but in good Lutheran fashion, we always say there needs to be a distinction, because they are not the same thing, right? There may be some overlaps. The church says don't kill anybody. The state also says don't kill anybody. Well, this is changing in modern society, but you get the idea, right? But what ultimately happens in regard to people wanting to get rid of this distinction and wanting to marry the two together, to have them almost kind of like a hypostatic union, as we've been talking about in our Christology series, which it's not, but that's what they're trying to do, is because they're not content with Christ's kingdom, which is not of this world. And so they say, the kind of like the disciples of Christ did, when they were in their time, they were looking for a Messiah that would free them from Roman oppression. And just in the same way that so many of the charismatic ilk are looking for a Christ who will heal their diseases, right? His work is not of this world. So he is in the world, but it's not what we are doing here is he's not there to free us from the Roman oppression or to get rid of tax cuts or whatever we think he's going to do. And at root, it is people's lack of contentment with what Christ has done in his church, and to say you also need to do this and this and this and this, and they expect it from God. And especially with the Israel issue, people start pointing to the scriptures themselves. Mm-hmm. And as someone who is from Jewish heritage, that's offensive to me. And I know it's offensive to most Israelite people who I would say that to, who are Jewish or of Jewish descent. But I'm sorry, it's offensive to me to say that to be a Jew is just a fleshly thing. It has never been so. It is not an ethnicity, really.
Sorry, can we pause?
Yeah, totally. Sorry about that, everybody. But just to finish the point that I was making is that the root of all of this socio-political entity thing that people think the church has to do with a misunderstanding of Old Testament Israel and its role and function in redemptive history and in the world. You see, it functions as a type of Christ, as a type of the kingdom of God, but it is not the thing itself, right? And this has to do with types and antitypes, and we don't want to get into all of that, but just so that you know, when you see people who are making these claims of that they're super obsessed with the nation of Israel, or perhaps, whatever the case is, their ethnic ties to the Jewish community, whether they're more so or less so than me, it is not only a case of this, but it is the root of this misunderstanding of the church. And I will now hand that off to you, Pastor Roman.
Oh, absolutely. And you're totally right. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's quite clear that trying to understand the modern manifestation that is known as Israel and stuffing it into a box of being somehow continuous with the Old Testament Israel is, I think, absurd, at least as a theological position. If you
Yeah.
want to claim that politically, sure, whatever. Like there are other claims that you can make, ethnically, whatever. But I think theologically, there's no way you can reconcile that position with what we read in the New Testament about the nation of Israel becoming that which is those who have faith in Christ. That's
Yeah.
the real nation of Israel. Therefore, the real church. Of course, when we speak of the nation of Israel in the New Testament, we're talking about the church. We're talking about the capital C church, the Church of Christ. Once again, not the denomination, but all the universal believers. So yeah, no, absolutely. And just kind of, I want to go back to something you said though, Connor, where you were pointing out the problem that a lot of these people want to kind of force the church and the state together because they're not happy with what Jesus has done. That's not really enough, Jesus. That thanks for dying for my sin and saving me from sin, death, and the devil, and giving me eternal life. Yeah, that's cool. But you know what else would be really cool is if you eliminated all these other social problems right now on my time, because you're a genie and you're supposed to do everything as I want it when I want it. And yeah, you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a million other things that if that was Jesus's mission back in the time that he was here during his earthly ministry, he would have done that. He didn't abolish slavery. That was bad. Everyone agrees that's bad. Well, actually, not everyone, unfortunately, agrees that's bad. But people from a Judeo-Christian worldview agree that it's bad. And at the end of the day, he didn't abolish patriarchy. He didn't abolish, kind of the sort of absolutely horrifically corrupt sort of bureaucracy that was in, Israel at the time. He didn't do any of these. He didn't liberate Israel from Roman occupation and create an independent state again. Like, he didn't do any of these things. He didn't solve hunger. He didn't eradicate poverty. He didn't eradicate every disease under the sun and say there will be no more disease. He didn't do any of these things because that's not what he was here to do. I mean, yes, of course, he fed the 5,000. Yes, of course, he healed the people. Yes, of course, he challenged the leadership. Yes, of course, he embodied the dignity of humanity by ministering to it and calling it to the higher purpose, to himself. But that ultimately is like these sort of social things that everyone obsesses over isn't what Jesus was here to do. He was here to save us from sin, death, and the devil. And he did that. And his church is here to proclaim that same gospel of Jesus Christ to save people from sin, death, and the devil. Now, that's great that over the time of us proclaiming that gospel, it has had an effect on society. It has. We eliminated slavery from our society. That is directly, I believe, related to the fact of the proclamation of the gospel over centuries. We have some of the most robust systems of healthcare, of child welfare and protection, one of the best systems of law, all these different things, which I believe are totally and utterly from proclamation of the gospel. But these are secondary things. These are results of the gospel being proclaimed. I'm not supposed to go to my pulpit on Sunday and say, Jesus demands that we open a new homeless shelter and we feed all the people until there's not a single other homeless person on the street. Well, no, that's not my job. And quite frankly, I couldn't do that because Jesus even himself said the poor will always be with you. What, do you want to call Jesus a liar? You think he was kidding when he said that? And that's why I kind of scoff at the sort of Marxist position that, if we just had enough, control, everyone could live this comfortable middle-class life. Yeah, that's never going to happen. That's never going to happen. And it's interesting because just, going on a bit of a rabbit trail here, really the Marxist promise of what the world could be is the eschatology minus God. That's really all it is. It's like, you know what? There will be no more pain and no more tear. Everyone will have their needs provided for them. All that, all this promise, but just you rip God out of the equation.
Yeah, I think a lot of it too is that people are totally missing really like Well, they're missing the whole concept. I mean, for one, we can look at the fact that all of these, as you mentioned, all of these good things that we have are from Christians. I wouldn't
Mhm,
say that they're a function of the church. And so at some time or another,
mhm,
they were, but that's not because of God. That's because people wrongly married the two things. But all of these things, education, hospitals, all good works and good politics, it is an act of new obedience,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
It is spontaneous. It is not from God forcing us to go and do things, but from His spontaneous grace creating a love for others within us. That's not a law thing insofar as compulsion or obligation.
mhm,
So that's really important in the way not only that we look at our own personal good works, but also at the Christians' good works in society and how the world is affected. And a lot of this comes down to both the you mentioned eschatology, premillennialism, and postmillennialism, especially in its old Puritan form. And I wrote a little article on eschatology called "The Eschatology of the Cross" that upset almost everybody, because what I said was, if your eschatology is proven wrong and you're losing hope and you don't know how to interpret scripture because things are going bad in the state or because things are going good in the state, right? We should neither expect everything to just plummet down, down, down until everything is a dystopian, horrible kind of society and we all implode and then Christ comes back. Neither should we be like the extreme post-millennial guys and say, oh, well, we have this now, Joe Biden is in, therefore my eschatology is broken and my hope in Christ is waning. Both of that is from a misunderstanding, again, to go back to Christ's work and to understand what good works and changes in society are new obedience, as the Article 6 of the Augsburg Confession, that they flow out of us spontaneously.
mhm.
Not because we are forced to do them, not because there's any kind of necessity of the function of the church. It's grace doing it through us. And it's not this kind of the church is the government or the government is the church or postmillennialism or premillennialism, neither of those things, right? So we need to look at what Christ was doing then on the earth, and that's what we need to say that the church is doing now. It's naming sin and it's forgiving sin. That's it, right? But what people have done, as I've been saying, and as Pastor Roland has been saying, is that what Christ did is entirely divorced from what the church is doing now and what we should be doing now as Christians. And they also do this with their own personal lives and saying Christ is the beginning to the Christian life. He's the gate that I enter into. And now I begin this self-betterment program. That's not it. And that's what they're doing with society too.
Mhm.
So this issue of the two kingdoms also relates to the personal individual Christian life. It's hand in glove. It's the same thing.
Absolutely, it is, because ultimately these people treat Christ as a catalyst rather than the Christ is the means and the end,
Yep.
not a catalyst. But a lot of people, and I wrote an article about this, about self-actualization and people using Christ as a self-actualizing agent. Well, sorry folks, but Christ is not a catalyst for your self-actualization journey. In fact, Christ is the self-actualization. Christ
Yeah.
in me is true self-actualization. And at the end of the day, if we're using either at an individual level Christ as just a way to, okay, well, now I'm going to become the real me, the me God created me to be, through using basically Christ as a door into now I can be my real me, or as a on a corporate level saying, okay, I've been converted to Christ. Now my job, my duty is to make sure that all the world has everything that it needs according to my personal worldview, that all social ills are annihilated, or that my particular party that lowers taxes or whatever gets elected, as if okay, this is as if these are good works, as if these things save. And that's actually the problem that I have with this. When you don't uphold the doctrine of the two kingdoms, is it starts to affect people's understanding of justification, because people start thinking like, well, if I don't march at the BLM protest, or if I don't go to the Trump rally or whatever, then I'm not a good believing person. I'm not going to go to heaven unless I vote a certain way or, speak out against certain issues, as if that had anything to do with the status of your soul and your salvation, which is literally insane. And so I encourage you to find my article and read about that. But also, there's another article I wrote that I think is relevant here, and I want to bring it up. And it's an article I wrote this past January called "On the Rejection of the Kingship of God: Contemporary Manifestation of an Age-Old Problem." And basically, I talk about what you were talking about earlier, Connor. This fact that people aren't happy with what the kingdom Jesus brought. They're not happy with the terms of Christ's kingdom. They're like, this sucks. So they reject it and set up their own attempts at a kingdom. It's like, and how they do this is, particularly on the right wing, how they do this is they find a leader and they say, this is basically our new Messiah. And if we just get him or her elected, then, the the golden age is going to break out. Jesus is going to come back and heaven and earth will be, united again. It's just sort of ridiculous. And then on the left hand side, the sort of progressive, and it's just like, if we could just get this ideology or this system in place, then everything would be perfect. If we just broke down the systematic oppression, if we just had this perfect system, then then basically heaven and earth would meet again, and all would be well under the sun. But ultimately, all those impetuses, all those actions are a rejection of the kingship of God, period.
Yeah. Yeah, I find it's really funny that, they go with like President so-and-so, but instead of the prefix, it should really have a suffix, like Donald Trump, the Baptist, forerunner of Jesus Christ, Perusia. Because it really is how it functions. I think you're really hitting the nail on the head there. And I think a text that we can go to as an instructive correction here is to the raising of the bronze serpent in Numbers, but specifically as Jesus Christ references it in John chapter 3, right? They were bitten by the serpents, and then their salvation from the serpents was not from any kind of antidote. It was not from any kind of removal of the venom from their blood system. It was from looking and trusting in the promise of God. That is the entire instruction. That's the Torah on this matter, right? And if we want to bring that further to a more concrete example with Christ being that bronze serpent, when we look at a promise to the end of sin, death, and suffering, what that looks like is suffering. It looks like Christ suffering. And so we look at that so often and we say, that can't be so. And so you have so many churches who are preaching from their pulpits that there is another suffering, a greater suffering that God has not promised to us, but that they're proclaiming that he has, as if they can make something greater than God has made for us, to try and drag heaven down here. And if you want to talk about the fulfillment of what we were talking about in the last episode, is people who are upset, who have this lack of an incarnational Christ, right, and an incarnational God. One way of solving that is to try and drag heaven down to earth with your political policies.
Yeah, which ultimately could never be heaven on earth. And that's the irony here. I mean, and this is where people start mistaking their philosophical and political presuppositions with the gospel. I think about it. If the left got everything they wanted or the right got everything they wanted, that wouldn't be heaven. Okay, and I have historical examples of this. The right gets everything that they want in a theocracy. Well, how well did those go? They were oppressive and brutal and destructive. Or, okay, the left got everything they want in the form of communism in Russia and China. Was that nice? This paradise that's promised both by both ideological extremes didn't break out. There was no paradise. Even though they got everything they wanted, they said, if we just had this or that, then it would be perfect. They were disasters. It was not heaven on earth. It was the closest thing to hell on earth in both cases, whether it be the oppressive theocracies or authoritarian regimes, or whether it be the sort of communist totalitarian death states, where you're more likely to go to the gulag than to anywhere else.
Yeah. And the funny thing is that even if they were to have these things, because they're still looking for God somewhere that he's not promised to be, they're still going to come out on the other end and say, why isn't God here? I thought God looked like economic reform, or I thought
Yeah.
God looked like equality, or I thought God looked like sexual freedom. When he's promised that he's coming in the word, in the baptism, and in the supper. And frankly, we are not listening. And that's always our problem.
Well, I don't think it's so much a we're not listening as it is a refusal to listen. It's
Mm,
more, I would say, especially in the West, it's more of a rejection of
yeah.
what God's offered. It says, no, I don't really like that. Hence all these revolutions we've had, all these sort of social change movements, of which now they just have amped up to insane levels in our current time, where it's like, paradise will break out after one more revolution, Conrad. It's like, really? Will it?
Yeah.
Paradise didn't break out after the sexual liberation of the 60s. Wow, world's highest divorce rates, life satisfaction rates, very low down, birth rates down, sort of families that are, not completely broken and destroyed by basically people engaging and endorsing their sexual licenses, all these things. It's like, well, I thought this was supposed to bring goodness to the world and wholeness and completeness and fullness, but sure enough, it didn't. And you're right, it doesn't matter the issue. Like, you can pick whatever issue you want, right, left, even issues that transcend the spectrum. It doesn't matter. Paradise isn't gonna literally manifest itself. Like, even if you got a total ban on abortion, let's say, as a lot of the pro-lifers would want, is paradise going to break out? Is it really? Is all of a sudden, oh man, now, the eagles crying as Jesus comes down, wrapped in an American flag, saying, "No, this is God's nation." Like, that's just not going to happen.
And there's
And
always going to be a next thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that's the thing. And I honestly think there's, just to go more into political theory, we're in this perpetual revolution, either on the right or the left. Just one more thing, one more thing, one more thing. And this is where I can't help but thank Burke, the political philosopher who observed what was going on in the French Revolution, and said, hold, hold on a minute, folks. I think this is a problem. And Burke's philosophical presupposition was, don't always expect that what you're replacing is going to be better than what's replaced. Like, don't assume that what you're going to put in place is going to be better than what you're seeking to remove. And he believed that change was necessary and should come over time, slowly, but he wasn't the sort of, burn the system now, eat the rich, stuff all the people in gulags that disagree with me, or the other end where it's like, oh, I don't like you, off to the helicopter trip you go, sort of Pinochet sort of right wing sort of thing either, right? Like, I mean, at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is, and I think this is something that Burke gets correct, is the idea that ultimately the family unit is the foundational building block of civilization. And I believe that's a corrective both to communism, where the state tries to be mother and father and God, but it's also a corrective to modern liberalism in the traditional sense of the word, like freedom, liberty, individuality, in the sense that you can't build a society on individuals, because individuals have a multiplicity of desires that can't all be met. That is literally impossible. So the smallest unit of a society is not, sorry, Ayn Rand, the individual. It's actually the family. That is the smallest unit of society. And there's no way around that. And fundamentally, civilizations that don't focus on that, we see how those work out. And I mean, at the end of the day, not to get too much into political theory, but to more get back into these facts, I mean, once again, I don't want to just say, oh, if we just had that system, everything would be perfect. Because once again, that's not the church's job. That's not the church's duty to put particular systems in place. The church's duty is to proclaim the gospel. And as you said, Connor, that will lead to the new obedience that will have impacts on other areas of life. But if I was sitting here at the church and proclaiming about how important family is, yeah, that might be true. It might even be a Christian value and virtue. That isn't my job. That isn't what I'm supposed to be doing. That's not what Christ called me to do. He called me to proclaim the gospel, because ultimately the best thing, what the church is called to do, and the best thing it can do for people, is put sinners to death with the law and raise them with the gospel. That's
Yeah.
what the church contributes to this world, nothing else.
And in doing that, you're raising the new humanity, right? And so we we can go back and forth about this concept, but I think what's really happening, again, it's not we can talk about it as the lack of contentment, but it's also a fear that if you said to one of these people who does believe that the church is to be, they believe this strongly, it is to be preaching socio or economic reform on left or on right, they'll again, and it's always, we've been talking about this for the last few whiles, it's always really a rejection and denial of the Article 6 on new obedience. It is always a fear, either in regard to works or in regard to faith, that if you don't enforce something on somebody, the Holy Spirit cannot and will not accomplish it. We're thinking like lawyers, right? Trying to restrict people, guide people, as if they have the ability to go and do it, whereas they don't. And so they need to, as you said, be killed and made anew into someone who will go and do it, right? And that's what we should be looking for. And so it's just, it really is. It's not only just a misunderstanding of two kingdoms and the connection between the presupposed connection between the two things, church and state, but it is also a, how would I say it? Oh, what was I saying before? I lost my train of thought. But it is also, oh yes, it is also a misunderstanding of law and gospel and how things get done and what changes. What brings obedience? Is it grace or is it the law? Well, Paul tells us that the law increases sin. So that's not the way to go. And yet that's the way that we've chosen to go in so many cases.
Well, and that's the irony, because what often happens in either on the right or left is people are given the gospel, oh, hallelujah, this is great, I'm saved. But then they're given the law and they're told, well, if you don't go to this social action ceremony, you're going to hell. Or if you don't, vote for this appropriate political party, or if you don't oppose, whatever social issue or support whatever social issue, well, you're going to hell. Well, that's a law. That's law. That isn't the gospel. That's not, and the problem is you're burdening consciences with things that they shouldn't be burdened with. Do I need to stand up to every social injustice that ever existed and ever will exist in order to go to heaven? Do I need to make sure that the party that aligns with my church's viewpoints gets elected over and over and over again, or else, the world's going to end because, the party of God, how blasphemous is that? But the party of God hasn't been elected. I mean, there's a perfect example of this in the Old Testament. I can't remember exactly where, but basically God sends an angel, and one of the prophets says, oh no, actually, sorry, it's in the book of Joshua, I think. And God sends his angel armies to help out Joshua. And Joshua comes up to the angel. He's like, whose side are you on, mine or theirs? And the angel just basically responds, I'm on God's side. I'm not on your side, and I'm not on his side.
Right.
Which kind of goes to show the sort of apolitical nature of God. So that's why, it is absolutely blasphemous to say God is a liberal, or God is a conservative, or God is a Republican, or God is a Democrat, or God is a communist. That's literally blasphemy, because we're trying to force God, who is our King and our Lord and our Savior for that matter, into one of our systems of thought.
Right.
into our idea of perfection, which is fundamentally pure law. Pure law.
Yep. And the things are pure law for good reason, right? I mean, God does give a law. And when we do function in society, in that left-hand kingdom, in the state, and I believe, if I recall correctly, you studied political this and that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So you studied for this, and you know that what it's trying to do is essentially not only, but it is working with law
Mm-hmm.
things. You
Mm-hmm.
can't. I've had to tell people this time and time again, because this is another way, for example, that this goes wrong. When people start trying to bring the gospel into the courtroom,
Mm-hmm.
that does not work. When
Mm-hmm.
people try to bring the gospel into the state, that does not work. You
Mm-hmm.
can't, because in the state we function on laws. In the
Mm-hmm.
court, we function on laws, right?
Yeah, and retributive justice, which is not what the gospel is.
Right, right. Or I even would struggle with rehabilitative justice as the gospel, when people, because people do posit it that way. And
Mm-hmm.
again, they're thinking of law, they're thinking of self-betterment and a self-improvement program, right? They're like, yeah, you did wrong, but God will take you and bring you back to this place of goodness and wholeness. Yeah, he will, through killing you. Not
Mm-hmm.
only in a spiritual way through Christ's body, but actually you will get a disease, or you will get hit by a car or something, and the old Adam in you will die, and you will rise out of the dirty ground.
Mm-hmm.
And that is your rehabilitation, if you want to think of it like that.
Yeah.
It's execution, right?
Well, and here's the problem. This is the problem more generally with humans' approach to utopia. And I kind of have this statement where basically this is my maxim. It's like utopia always leads to gulags and gas chambers. And the reason why is because when you're so fixed on enacting your vision of the good instead of living within God's vision of the good and letting God enact the vision of the good through Christ, as he literally said that he will do and has done to an extent already. We're already in the new kingdom of Christ. But basically, what happens if you're so obsessed, neurotically charged of enacting your version of the good, well, anything that doesn't fit in that, you might tolerate for a while, but eventually it becomes intolerable. If we just got rid of this group of people, oh, then society would be perfect, right? So what happens? Gas chambers and gulags
Yeah.
every single time. This is what happens when humans try to put out utopia. And this is a disturbing fact, because at the end of the day, people always start to just resort to the final solution. In fact, for people that think this way, the final solution actually is the logical end to that argument.
Yeah.
Because, and that's where it's like you can't fault Hitler and the Nazis for logical incoherence. You really can't, because it actually, if what they believed was really true and they really believed utopia was going to do that, it was only logical to do the final solution. But of course, we know as Christians that that's evil and disgusting and vile. But this is exactly what can happen. This is exactly what happens when we don't let God be God, and when we start to pervert the doctrine of the two kingdoms, and we start to understand that, oh, well, we can bring utopia to earth now.
Yep.
Hitler didn't bring utopia to earth. Stalin didn't bring utopia to earth. Mao didn't bring utopia to earth. Trump didn't bring utopia to earth, contrary to what many evangelicals seem to think. And Biden certainly isn't going to bring utopia either. All the sort of progressive Christians that think now that Biden's in charge, paradise is, no, he won't. Sorry to burst your bubble. He won't bring utopia any more than Trump didn't bring utopia for the right wingers and the Trumpers.
Right. And so at the end, I think, and perhaps this could also be the end of the podcast. I actually don't know how long we've been running for, because we had a pause in the middle. But at the end, I think we are forced with a question or several questions. And I think those are, not I think, I know, the questions that we're focused on, or forced, or how would you say this, faced with, is the state is there for a reason. because God gave it to us, and God does rule over that kingdom. And the church is given by God as well. Of course, no one's arguing he doesn't reign over that kingdom. So people always want to know, how then should a Christian vote? And how should the state work? And what is the purpose of the state? Do you think, you, with your expertise and your studies in political such and such, and also as a Lutheran pastor, could you give them a quick answer to what is the church, what is the state, and to wrap everything up we've said? I know this is a big ask, I'm sorry, but and then to tell them exactly how they are to live in the middle of that, living in both worlds as dual citizens, as Paul says.
Mhm. Well, I'm going to try and remember all those questions and tackle them one for one. I'll probably have to ask you, but just as a context, Connor keeps referring to this fact that I kind of studied political stuff. Well, prior to entering the ministry, I was planning on going the public policy route. And I was actually accepted into a public policy graduate program before I felt the call, heard the call, whatever you want to call it. God called me into the ministry. And so I'm quite familiar with a lot of these political theories, a lot of policy and the goal of policy and what you're trying to do. So I know that very well. And at the end of the day, what we need to understand is, what is the church? Well, the Augsburg Confession says that the church is where the gospel is rightly preached and the sacraments are rightly administered. Okay, that's the church, not where the social programs are, not where the pro-lifer coalition is, not where the whatever the Republican flag is, not where the Democrat flag is, not where the no. The church is where the gospel is rightly proclaimed, sacraments are administered, and I would argue, and this is my kind of addition to that, where the fruit and the gifts of the Spirit are made manifest. Once again, that's kind of my little additive to that. But regardless, that is the church. Nothing else qualifies and quantifies the church. And the church's task is to do those things faithfully, nothing else. And so it really, the only time what you should fault the church for is not doing that. You shouldn't fault the church for, well, you're not involved in this, and you're not. No, that's not my calling. And in fact, I honestly think it isn't an appropriate use of my time as a called and ordained minister of the church. I am called to do that, not called to get myself involved in politics, not called to get myself involved in every social issue and action, not called myself to get embroiled in every controversy. Like, that isn't my job. And quite frankly, I've watched a lot of pastors who do that, and sad to say, and this is, I don't really mean this rudely, but this is just the fact, they end up not having any time for real ministry. They end up not having any time to actually do the things that God has called them to do, to preach the word, to teach the word, to administer the sacraments, to disciple people and equip people in the church, to rebuke and train up in righteousness. They don't have time to do those things because they're so consumed by politics or policy or social action, which is sad. There's room for Christians to get involved in those things, but that is not the job of a minister. Sorry, that just isn't. And that's why I like what Charles Spurgeon said. He said people always demanded, oh, Charles Spurgeon, you should. And of course, Charles Spurgeon is a famous, 19th century Reformed Baptist preacher out of England. And people always say, oh, Charles Spurgeon, you should be in politics. You should be in politics. And he basically gave the same answer that I'm saying. It's like, no, that's not what I'm called to do. I'm called to do this. What business do I have getting involved in that? What business, that would be a total defeat of the purpose and the office of the ministry to which I have been called. And I very much understand it the same way. And furthermore, just from a clerical perspective, it creates stumbling blocks. If I walked around with my membership to my whatever political party in my pocket, that automatically creates a division between me and someone who might hold a membership to something else. And I don't think that's what Christ wants us to do. Christ says all things to all people. Christ wants us to remove stumbling blocks. not add them by saying, well, you can come to church if you become, a card-carrying member of the Conservative Party and you're pro-life, and then, but otherwise you're not welcome here. Like, is that really? Is that, or the same thing at the other church? If I walk to the church and they say, well, you can't come in unless you're a card-carrying, Liberal or NDP or Green Party. Oh, no, you're not welcome here. Well, that's putting stumbling blocks, and that's not the church. So, sorry, what was the second question?
The second question was the same, but of the state.
Okay, yeah. What is the state? Well, what is the state? The state was instituted by God, by divine authority, to keep order. Okay, anarchy is not God's design for the world. Sorry, anarchists and, minarchists and libertarians of the extreme variety. Anarchy is not what God intended for humanity. And so the state does bring order. And as we see as well in Romans, as Paul talks about, the state is the agent to bring God's wrath upon wrongdoers. As Paul says, the agents of the state don't carry the sword for no reason, right? They bear the sword to keep order. Now, of course, that does not mean that God desires them to be tyrannical. That does not mean that the government can just do whatever it wants and say, well, I'm God's agent, so I'm just going to start this, puppy killing operation and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, no, you can't do that, right? You can't start a puppy mill and then just turn it into a meat packing plant. Like, that's just, no, or you can't just open a concentration camp like China is currently doing with the Uyghur Muslim population in China. Like, no, you're not supposed to do that. Is a violation of God's authority given to the state. The state is properly understanding itself as enacting, enacting. I mean, if I really want to go into a Thomas Aquinas, it's basically the state is supposed to enact natural law and be guided by reason, in a sense. That's basically what the state is supposed to be doing. Would you have anything else to say about the state?
I just think it's really, really important to get that the state is to enact natural law. And I think I don't think Luther agrees with that wholeheartedly. And that was a really big push in what we call the two kingdoms, is that it is that natural law that the state is supposed to be enforcing. And that's not a bad word when we talk about the state, because they are there to uphold the law. But one thing I also want to remind people of, when this will sound maybe scary to them, that you will have bad governments in the world. But that does not mean that the church needs to go and take them over.
Yeah.
It means that they are misusing and failing to rightly observe their call as officers of the state.
Yes. And the church can call them out on that, not from the pulpit, but just because Christians, truly renewed people, according to new obedience, will say to the state, oh, actually, no, you can't operate concentration camps. Like Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer didn't try. Bonhoeffer is actually the perfect example. He didn't try to take the state over by the church. He didn't say, well, Hitler's setting up these concentration camps and he's rounding up, Jewish people. Let's try and use the church to take over the state. No. Bonhoeffer was infamously or famously, depending on the opinion you take, involved in a plot to remove Hitler, to kill Hitler. And, whether or not that was right, of course, is a big debate. But regardless of whether or not that was right, his intent was never, I'm going to use the church as a bludgeoning weapon to restore the state. No. That's not the church's job. And Bonhoeffer knew that. He knew it wasn't the church's job to do that. And you're right. And this is where we get uncomfortable. This is where we live in the tension, that it's not the church's job to do that. That even if there's an evil state, it's not the church's job to come in and say, well, we're in charge now, because that is not what God has called the church to do. Yes, people renewed will challenge evil where they find it and tyranny where they find it, but that is not the church's job. It's not my job as an ordained minister to go to my city council if it's taken over by a tyrant and say, I'm in charge now. That's not what I was called to do. And the third question? Sorry, I'm going on and on and on about the first two questions. I can't even remember the third.
Well, that's good. I think it does answer the third question, because you have fully answered them so well that I think it does answer the third. And the third was just, how does a Christian live in that tension? And so I'll just wrap it up for us with a little doodly-doo bow, just on top of what you said, was the Christian needs to hold both things together. They need to hold both the law and the gospel, but they are totally different things. With the gospel, we are receiving it. With the law, we are doing it. The law and the state, we do that for our neighbor, right?
Mhm.
And I have started writing something on the concept of human rights and the concept of the state and the law, not as something done for or to us, but that we are doing in service for another. Whereas we come to church, we receive gifts. That's where we live in tension, not in one or the other, but both. And this goes back to that last podcast that we did before. Is Christ God or is he man? Well, he's both, right? Is it heaven or is it earth? Well, it's both. And that's our answer. We live in the tension. And so that's what we do. We need to hold them in tandem together. If that seems paradoxical to us, that's too bad. And eventually we will die. And in the New Jerusalem, I don't think that we will be having political elections. But for right now, we are, and we need to get our hands a little bit dirty to get any good done in this earth, right? So sin boldly, my friends.
Yeah, and I would just say, a lot of people misunderstand the doctrine of two kingdoms, or try and say it's like, well, oh, I'm taking an apolitical stance. I'm actually not. There's a sense in which I'm not, but I'm not making my ministry a political stance.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And I never will. And God forbid that I ever do. And I do hope I have people to correct me if I ever do, because that is not my duty.
Yeah. Yeah. Pastors can be licensed members of political parties, but their parishioners should not have to know what those parties are. So without further ado, I think we've covered this. What do you think?
You know what? It's good. I mean, like, I could go on for on and on, but you know what? I think we've sufficiently covered this topic.
For today, we may come back and we may talk about the history of two kingdoms. That'd be an interesting thing to do and to dive into. But thanks for you coming and for doing the introduction so well, and for the listener. And we hope to see you again, perhaps in a month's time, for the blessing of the listener. All right. God's peace to everybody, and have a good day. Hope everyone is well with the pandemics and the reopenings. Phase 3. Yeah. All right.